The wind carried the smell of rain and gunpowder that a lone cowboy stood at the edge of his small homestead, the barrel of his rifle resting lightly against his leg. His eyes were fixed on the figure in the distance, a small child, no more than 6 or 7, standing barefoot in the mud. Her face streaked with dirt, her black hair tangled by the wind. She wasn't crying anymore, but her chest trembled as if each breath hurt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Something about her stillness made his stomach twist. She didn't look lost. She didn't look like she was waiting for help. She looked like someone who had already seen too much. He lowered the rifle just a hair. Then her eyes lifted to his, and he saw the tears welling again, silent, as if she was too tired to even cry out. But let's go back to where it all started. The cowboy's name was Eli Ward. 42 years old, weathered by sun and loss, with calloused hands that knew the heft of both rope and rifle. His ranch sat miles from town, a lonely stretch of land that barely gave him enough cattle to trade for supplies every few months. He didn't complain. There was no one to complain to anymore. He'd built the place himself, back when life had felt fuller. Back when a woman named Clara sat on the porch with her needlework and laughter came easy in the evenings. That was before the fever, before the graves dug under the cottonwood tree. These days, Eli lived quiet. He fixed fences. He rode the perimeter of his land at dawn. He drank coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Nights, he sat by the fire with the company of creaking wood and the occasional howl of coyotes. The prairie had a way of making men disappear inside themselves. That morning had been like any other. Eli was mending a busted rail along the north fence, sweat cutting trails through the dust on his face, when he heard it, soft at first, then louder at a sound that didn't belong. He straightened, hat brim low against the sun, and listened. A whimper, faint, but close. His hand went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Another sound, a shuffle of small feet, not boots. There, Eli stepped slow, boots crunching on dry grass, eyes scanning the land. A shape appeared just past the mesquite trees, crouched low like a scared animal. The child didn't see him at first. She was busy digging at the dirt with her hands, searching for something to eat. Roots, maybe, or bugs. Her frame was all bone and skin, and her dress, if you could call it that, was torn nearly to rags. When she looked up, their eyes met. For the briefest moment, Eli forgot to breathe. She was Apache. Every warning he'd ever heard in town rang loud in his head. Don't take in a starving Indian child. Don't get involved. It'll bring trouble faster than rattlers in spring. That Eli's jaw tightened. He didn't move, and neither did she. The wind stirred the grass between them. He could see her chest rising and falling too fast, like she'd been running for miles. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that had dried into white lines of salt. And then, the smallest sound, a sob, half swallowed, as if she'd learned not to cry too loud. Eli lowered his rifle, but his mind spun. Was she lost? Left behind? Escaped from something worse? There were no answers, just those dark, shining eyes fixed on his. Eyes that carried more pain than a child should ever know. By the time he stepped forward, his boots sinking into the wet earth, she backed away. Easy now, he said softly, voice rough from disuse. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. Eli crouched down, setting the rifle aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of jerky, holding it out with an open palm. Her eyes darted to the food. The hesitation was short. Hunger won. She stepped forward, slow, like a deer ready to bolt, and snatched the jerky before retreating 2 paces. Her teeth tore into it like she hadn't eaten in days. Eli watched, heart heavy. He wanted to ask her name. He wanted to know what had happened, but all he could do was watch her chew, her small hands trembling around the dried meat. A cloud passed over the sun, and that was when Eli felt it. The prickling weight of being watched. His eyes lifted to the far hills, that a glint of sunlight on metal. Someone out there. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to know. Eli stood slowly, every instinct telling him this wasn't just chance. This child didn't stumble onto his land by accident. And whoever was out there, they were waiting to see what he would do next. Eli stood there, boots heavy in the wet earth, the rifle loose in his grip. The girl gnawed on the jerky, her eyes darting between him and the open prairie. The glint he'd seen on the distant ridge was gone now. Maybe just sun on stone, maybe not. He swallowed hard, scanning the horizon one last time before crouching down again. "You're safe here," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't understand. Her small shoulders twitched at the sound of his voice. She'd finished the jerky already and was clutching the last shred of it like she wasn't sure there'd be more. Eli reached into his coat pocket, pulled out another strip, and offered it. This time, she didn't back away. By the time he led her toward the barn, the sun had dipped low enough to cast the land in long, gold shadows. She followed at a distance, each step hesitant. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay and old leather. Eli set down a pail of water, filled from the trough outside. She knelt instantly, cupping her hands to drink. Watching her, Eli felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen starving men before, seen what war did to folks, but never a child left to survive alone. "Where the hell do you come from?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. She looked up at him with wide eyes, water dripping from her chin. That evening, Eli rode into town. Dry Creek was little more than a row of weathered buildings: saloon, blacksmith, general store, sheriff's office. A couple of lanterns flickered in the windows as the sun slid away. He tied up his horse outside the saloon. The place smelled of sweat, whiskey, and old wood. Inside, the regulars were gathered around tables, card games clinking with coins. A few heads turned when Eli walked in. He wasn't a man who came to town often. "Evenin', Ward," Sheriff Tom Burrows greeted from the corner table. Burrows was a thick man with a mustache that looked like it belonged on a judge more than a lawman. Eli tipped his hat. "Sheriff, you're out late. Cattle trouble?" Eli didn't answer right away. He stepped up to the bar, ordered coffee instead of whiskey. Burrows' eyes narrowed. "Something on your mind?" Eli sipped the coffee. It was bitter, but it gave him a second to think. "There's a child on my land," he said finally. The saloon quieted a bit. Conversations stilled. "What kind of child?" one of the card players asked, leaning back in his chair. Eli set the cup down. "Apache." The silence thickened. "You send her on her way?" Burrows asked. Eli didn't answer. The sheriff's voice dropped. "Ward, you know better. It's one thing to hand her food, but keeping her? You're a skin for trouble. She's starving, Tom. That ain't the point. Her people will come looking. You want them thinking you took her." A man at the card table snorted. "Let him come. One less tribe we gotta worry about." Eli's jaw clenched. Another voice chimed in. "Ward, you've heard the stories same as us. Apache don't just lose kids. If she's out here, it means something bad happened, and whoever did it won't be far behind. You don't want that fight on your doorstep." Eli stared down into his coffee. Silent, he'd buried enough to know they weren't wrong. But then he saw her face again. The hollow cheeks, the trembling hands clutching a scrap of food like it was life itself. "Sometimes right ain't the same as safe," he muttered. Burrows shook his head. "Don't do this, Eli. I'm telling you as a friend. Take her to the edge of your land, point her east, and let her people find her." Eli met his eyes. "And if her people ain't alive to find her?" No one answered that. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. By the time he reached the barn, the girl was curled up in the hay, eyes barely open. She looked smaller now, fragile as a bird. Eli knelt beside her, laid a blanket over her shoulders. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see him. For the first time, she didn't flinch. He sat there a long while, listening to the quiet creak of the barn, the far-off cry of night birds. The next morning, the choice was made. Eli cooked beans and cornbread over the fire, setting aside a portion for her. She ate slow this time, glancing at him between bites like she was still waiting for him to change his mind. He saddled his horse, but didn't pack the rifle. The girl stood at the doorway, watching as he carried water to the trough. "Guess you're staying," he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but when she followed him into the sunlight, close enough that her bare foot brushed his boot, Eli knew she understood enough. By midday, riders appeared on the ridge. 3 of them. They didn't come closer, just sat there, watching. Eli felt his stomach knot that he didn't reach for his gun. The girl stood beside him, her tiny hand clutching the edge of his coat. The riders didn't move, didn't wave, didn't shout. They just turned their horses and disappeared back over the ridge. The prairie was too quiet after that. Eli had seen enough signs to know this wasn't over. And when it came, it wouldn't just be a knock at his door. The prairie had grown restless. Eli felt it in the silence between the wind gusts, in the way the birds stayed hidden, in how the girl refused to stray more than a few feet from him. She'd begun to follow him everywhere, into the barn, out, to the trough. Even when he chopped firewood that on the third morning, he found a pile of stones stacked neatly by the edge of his property. 6 small rocks balanced on top of each other, no bigger than his fist. It wasn't there yesterday. That evening, Eli sat by the fire with his coffee, the girl curled under a blanket on the floor. She'd spoken a few words earlier in the day, soft, halting syllables in Apache. He didn't know what they meant, but her tone carried something heavy. He wished Clara were alive. Clara had a way of knowing what people needed, even without words. The fire popped, throwing sparks up into the dark. The girl stirred suddenly, eyes snapping open. Then Eli heard it too. Hoofbeats. Slow, distant, but coming closer. Eli stood, rifle in hand. He stepped out into the night, moonlight silvering the land. Down the dirt road, 2 riders approached. Not fast, not slow, just steady, deliberate. They stopped 100 yards from the porch point. One of them called out, "Ward." Eli knew the voice. Calvin Brooks, a rancher whose land bordered his to the west. "You out here talking in strays now?" Calvin called. Eli stayed silent, but Calvin's horse pawed at the dirt. "We seen her. The Apache child." Eli lifted the rifle, resting it across his arm. Not aiming, just holding. "Don't do this, Ward," Calvin said. "You know what this means. They'll come for her. Maybe for all of us." The second rider, a wiry man with a sunburned face, spat in the dirt. "Ain't right. She don't belong here. Send her back or let her die out there, like the rest of 'em." Eli stepped down from the porch. "She's just a child," he said, voice even. "That ain't the point." Calvin snapped. "This is war, Ward. You take her in, you choose. Aside, you think they'll see it any different?" Eli glanced back at the doorway. The girl stood there, eyes wide, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Calvin's voice softened. "You're a good man, Ward, but you're making a mistake. Town's already talking. Sheriff's getting pressure. You keep her, you're dragging all of us into this." Eli didn't answer. The second rider sneered. "Should have known. Eli Ward, man who can't keep his own house full, decides to play savior to a filthy savage." Eli's grip on the rifle tightened. Calvin nudged his horse closer. "You think on it, Ward. 'Cause when her people come, and they will, you'll be alone." The 2 men turned and rode off, their silhouettes fading into the night. For a long while, Eli stood there, staring at the empty road. The girl hadn't moved. When he finally turned toward her, she stepped back into the shadows like she was afraid he'd send her away. He knelt down. "You ain't going anywhere," he said quietly. She didn't understand the words, but when he held out his hand, she stepped forward and placed hers in it, small, cold, and trembling. The next day, he found more signs, feathers tied to a tree branch near the creek, boot tracks that weren't his. A dead rabbit left on his porch, its throat cut clean. By nightfall, the air felt thick with waiting. Eli had been in fights before. He'd buried men who'd crossed the wrong lines. But this wasn't a barroom quarrel or a land dispute. This was something older, heavier, justice moving slow as a storm. The girl barely ate that night. She sat by the fire, hands folded tight in her lap. When Eli crouched down beside her, she looked up at him and whispered a single word. He didn't know its meaning, but her eyes told him everything. Feared. A new sound drifted across the plains, not hoofbeats, not voices, drums, slow, steady, carried on the wind like a heartbeat. Eli stood and stepped onto the porch. The girl followed, clutching the blanket to her chest. Far on the ridge, torches glimmered. He knew then they weren't waiting for morning. They were coming tonight, and Eli Ward had to decide. Fight, surrender, or face them with nothing but the truth. The drums grew louder as night settled heavy over the prairie. Eli stood at the edge of his porch, rifle in hand, but he hadn't raised it. The girl stayed close to his leg, clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Out beyond the barn, torches moved like fireflies on the ridge. 15, maybe 20 riders. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They came steady. with the kind of patience that made Eli's chest tighten. When the riders finally appeared in full view, the firelight caught the paint on their faces. Apache warriors, silent as ghosts, approached in a slow column. Eli stepped down from the porch, his boots sinking into the dirt. The girl's hand slipped from his coat as she froze, staring wide-eyed at the men on horseback. One rider dismounted first. An older man, his face lined with age, scars running down his jaw. He carried no rifle, only a long spear marked with feathers and red cloth point. Two more riders followed, younger men who held torches but kept their weapons low. The older man walked forward until only a few yards separated him from Eli. Neither spoke. Eli slowly lowered the rifle until it rested against his leg. The old warrior's eyes flicked toward the girl. She didn't move. Then, softly, she whispered something. Eli didn't know the words, but the warrior did. His face broke, not into anger, but into something heavier. His shoulders sank as though he'd been holding his breath for days. The two younger riders behind him shifted uneasily. One of them whispered to the other. The girl took a step forward. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She said the word again, louder this time. The old man turned his head slightly, and Eli caught the shine of tears at the corners of his eyes that he crouched down, slow, deliberate, and held out his arms. For the first time since she'd arrived, the girl moved without fear. She ran. The warrior caught her up, his hands shaking as he held her against his chest. He murmured something in Apache, words heavy with grief and relief all at once. The younger riders lowered their heads. Eli stood there, silent. He'd expected anger, maybe even violence. Instead, what stood before him was something raw, something that stripped the night bare of every other sound. The warrior looked up at him. His lips trembled as he spoke, slow and broken in English. "You saved my blood." Eli didn't answer right away. His throat felt tight, like the words wouldn't come. "She was alone," he said finally. "Hungry, scared." The warrior nodded once. One of the younger riders stepped forward, speaking sharply in Apache. The old man held up a hand, silencing him. He turned back to Eli. "You did what many men here would not. For this," he placed a hand to his chest, "I honor you." The girl reached out suddenly, fingers brushing Eli's sleeve. She looked at him like she was memorizing his face, like she understood more than either of them could say. Then she buried her face against the warrior's chest, holding tight. No one moved for a long time. The only sounds were the wind in the grass and the soft crackle of torches. Finally, the warrior stepped back. He said something to his men, and they all dismounted, standing in a half-circle around Eli. The old man removed a leather pouch from his belt, opened it, and placed a small carved figure in Eli's hand. A bird, shaped from bone. "For you," he said quietly. "So my people remember. Not all white men forget how to be human." Eli closed his hand around the figure. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded once. The warrior returned to his horse, lifting the girl up gently. Before mounting, the child looked back one last time. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but all she managed was a soft, "Thank you." Her voice was fragile, accented, but cleared. It broke something in Eli's chest he didn't know was still hold. He stepped back as the warriors turned, the torches flickering as they rode into the night. The drums were gone now. Only silence remained. Eli stayed outside long after they vanished, the carved bird still warm in his palm. For the first time in years, he felt something shift deep inside, a quiet he hadn't known since before the graves under the cottonwood tree. Dawn came slow, spilling gold light over the prairie. Eli hadn't slept. He sat on the porch, coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the sun climb. The carved bird lay on the table beside him, its smooth edges catching the morning light. The land was quiet again. No drums, no torches on the ridge, just the wind and the creak of the barn door in the breeze. He found himself walking to the cottonwood tree, the one where two small graves lay side by side, marked with simple stones. Clara and the baby they never got to raise. Eli knelt in the dirt, hat pressed to his chest. "I think you'd have liked her," he said softly. The words surprised him. They felt too easy, too right. That afternoon, Eli rode into town, Sheriff Burroughs stood on the boardwalk outside his office, arms crossed, expression tight. "Well?" the sheriff asked. "They come for her." Eli tied his horse to the post, stepped up onto the boardwalk. "They came," he said. Burroughs studied him. "And they took her home." The sheriff exhaled, like he'd been holding it in for too long. "You got lucky," he muttered. Eli shook his head. "No, just found the right kind of men on the other side." Word spread fast, the way it always did in towns like Dry Creek. Some folks nodded in quiet respect. Others muttered that Eli Ward was a fool who'd nearly brought trouble to their doorsteps. Eli didn't argue. He didn't feel the need to death. Days passed. Life settled back to the way it had been, fixing fences, tending cattle, evenings by the fire. But something had changed. The silence in the house no longer felt like a wound. A week later, Eli found something at the edge of his property that a single feather tied to a small bundle of dried sage. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. That it wasn't a warning, that it was a thank you. Years passed. Eli grew older, slower. His ranch stayed small, quiet, just the way he liked it. Every so often, he'd find signs left for him. A deer hide left by the barn, a carved piece of bone on his fence post. He never saw her again. But one spring morning, long after the world had moved on, Eli rode into town for supplies at the general store. He heard her voice. Older now, steadier. He turned, and there she was, not a girl anymore, but a young woman dressed in both Apache and settler clothing, speaking English as easily as her own tongue. She smiled when she saw him. "Eli Ward," she said softly, like she'd carried the name for years. They didn't talk long, just enough for her to thank him again. Properly this time. Then she left with her people, vanishing down the road the same way she'd once come into his life. As Eli rode back to his ranch, the carved bird still hung from his saddle. He looked out at the endless prairie, the wind combing through the grass, and for the first time in decades, he felt a quiet peace. Some choices never stopped mattering, and this one had changed everything. The sky stretched wide and blue above him as he rode home, alone, but no longer lonely.